As an anti-religion, Satanism has to be an antipode to the metaphysical principles of the religion it subverts. Metaphysics proper is in its essence a methodical mental approach towards principles and causes that lie beyond partial experience of finite existence, i.e., it is an attempt at thinking of the unbounded origin or origins of all. It cannot be enclosed in a system of science or in any way bounded by limited, that is, human intelligence, but only approached by free act of thinking. Any knowledge we can properly call metaphysical is a gift from the higher to that which is lower. Let us keep this in mind, because it is crucial to understand how both religion and metaphysics can be subverted by its antipodes. As we are dealing here with the modern Satanism, which I don't consider being identical with the Satanism proper, not out of any lack of will on behalf of its adherents admittedly, it is essential to point out that it has its own humanist-based metaphysics, the one that turns traditional notion of metaphysical knowledge on its head. As we shall soon see, this means that left-hand path is conditioned by modernity, and it is using a modern and postmodern kind of mental methods to get in touch with its origins. One could argue that Order of the Nine Angles' insistence on radical individualism, individuation in quasi-Jungian sense, and personal experience, that is what they call dark empathy, as conditio sine qua non of the quote-unquote true satanic character, oral tradition, and numinous knowledge, is an example of hypermodernity transcending even some of its greatest excesses embodied in radically totalitarian political projects of 20th century. At this stage of our analysis, we'll attempt to depict what this metaphysics, or better to say, counter-metaphysics, really is. The astonishing thing is that it is extremely resonant with what is considered to be academically respectable and established outlook in the 20th century philosophy, i.e., the so-called continental tradition of the contemporary academic philosophy. Because both David Maillet and contemporary French and German professor of philosophy share some common points of intellectual origin, clearly exemplified by tendency to acclaim the same founding father, namely Martin Heidegger. The German thinker of quote-unquote radical new beginnings seems to pop up every once in a while when you nosedive into deeper left-hand path waters, where big intellectual sharks prowl, while Alexander Dugin made a great fuss about Heidegger as a prophet and an quote-unquote envoy of being. Other, less famous but nonetheless sinister individuals like David Maillet used his phenomenology with less fanfare, yet with the same motive, to demonstrate the truth of their metaphysics and political ideology stemming thereof. In this respect, we'll refer our analysis to one Order of the Nine Angles text from 1980, titled Symbols and Being, and devoted to explicitly Heideggerian interpretation of left-hand path notion of the relationship of acausal and causal as an interplay between non-being and being. The purpose of Order of the Nine Angles metaphysics is, as we repeatedly discern from its writings, a practical one, the working of magic. However, the usual modern definition of this practice is somewhat amended, or better to say, hypermodernized. The magic, namely, is something more than quote-unquote bringing about change through act of will. Quote from Order of the Nine Angles, manuscript Naos. Quote, "For a long time, the nature of the left-hand path has been misunderstood. The traditional definition as magic used for personal, destructive, or negative purposes is meaningless because it assumes a framework of moral opposites, which does not in reality exist in relation to magical energies. All evolution of consciousness is a magical act, an expansion of the acausal into realm of the causal. From the traditional moral Nazarene, the term Nazarene in Order of the Nine Angles denotes Christianity, and Mayat is obviously trying to follow Satanist tradition of never pronouncing the name of Jesus. Just a note here. We continue the quote. Nazarene point of view, all such evolution of necessity becomes evil. It is unfortunate that for a long time this simple fact has been obscured by silly systems like Kabbalah. By this he means Kabbalah, with its notions of the dark side of the tree, and this means Kabbalistic tree of life. Now watch this. Listen to this attentively. No dark side exists because what actually exists is dark of itself, because its presence is non-being. End quote. Therefore, by going beyond good and evil, the individual must step into absolute evil, the evil which has no opposite because it itself is all there is, or more precisely, and at the same time, everything that isn't. Quote-unquote, a transcendental horizon, to maliciously use the Heidegger's term, of any future question on the meaning of being, and Prolegomena to any future satanic political project. Let us not get confused by fancy philosophical terminology, because this is what Mayat, and with him some other individuals we mentioned in the first part of this analysis, want to practically introduce in the world, that is causal or phenomenal realm, as they call it. As we shall see, it is the utmost extremity of the metaphysics of evil, and astonishingly, at the same time, the utmost extremity of modernity, or at least the modern mentality. By mentality, I denote the relationship of man towards metaphysical origin, or origins. The modern mentality is thus qualified as a certain anti-metaphysical rationality, i.e., rationality that strives to put the man in the center as creative originator, or at least, as is the case in Heidegger and Order of the Nine Angles, a necessary mediator of those attributes of the world that were traditionally ascribed to God. Everything successive to him, i.e., angels, soul, spirit, magic, providence, demons, etc., is swept away too in the course of the process Max Weber aptly denoted as Entzauberung, or disenchantment of the world. Heidegger was seemingly the most radical philosophical critic of this process in the 20th century, yet the truth is that he was in fact more likely its consequent propagator, the one who really made a lifelong intellectual effort to drive it to its pseudo-apocalyptic conclusion. David Mayat, writing under the pseudonym Thorold West, proves to be his apt pupil, although with a pronounced affinity to natural sciences, which Heidegger detested. Although left-hand path luminaries are more prone to use Carl Gustav Jung, from whom they borrow and to an extent distort a good deal of terminology, such as numinous, causal, individuation, archetypes, etc., Mayat's treatment of Heidegger is ominous because there really is no need for distortion of original terminology. It fits the order of the nine-angle mentality hand in glove. Heidegger's thinking revolves around the notions of quote-unquote ontological difference and quote-unquote oblivion of being, Seinsvergessenheit. Where former denotes the difference of beings, Seiende, as disclosed in the answer to a question of what is each individual being, and being, Sein, as a meaning of is, disclosing the meaning of every being without being any one of them, while later term refers to human tendency to forget this difference. Namely, human being, insofar as it is in the meaningful relationship to being, has a necessary tendency to lose itself among beings, while forgetting both its and other beings' origin in being itself. This is Dasein, or the existence, a notion that Heidegger introduced by giving a new meaning to a rather profane German word, Dasein. Literary being here can be understood as human being only insofar as human has some relation to being itself. This means that Dasein is primarily the being of relation, a kind of mediator that discloses being because it is the only being whose essence consists precisely in an ability to have a meaningful relation to being in general. Heidegger argued that oblivion of being originates from the conflation of individual beings and being itself, i.e., of picking the one being from the world and turning it into some kind of metaphysical principle, more or less always a god, or at least a divine or eternal substance. This is the consequence of oblivion of ontological difference between beings and being itself. He wants to go beyond, and after 2,500 years of philosophical tradition, start, quote-unquote, radically anew. What needs to be done is a quote-unquote destruction of traditional ontology all the way down to Plato and Aristotle, and to be more exact to Parmenides, pre-Socratic, as an attempt to find that which was partially disclosed but always simultaneously veiled in the epochal insights of great philosophers. Now, epoch, or epoche in Greek, for Heidegger has a strict meaning of finite disclosure of meaning of being that sways the given historical moment, and not a historical epoch in the sense of aggregate of political, economical, or social events. So there was a time when being was disclosed as eternal idea in Plato, an eternal origin of continuous process, that is kinesis, and kinuna, kineton, unmoved mover, or God, in Aristotle, or, at the peak of the modernity, will unto power, an eternal recurrence of the same, ewige Wiederkehr des Gleichens in Nietzsche. All of these notions are not simply mistakes of individual philosophers, but disclosures conditioned by Dasein's being delivered unto being. It's making present Anwesen of what is by its nature always absent, abwesen, from the world, yet necessary to endow it with meaning. This presenting, Gabe, in German, or as left-hand path practitioner would put it, presencing, stems from the tendency to comprehend being in the terms of present while forgetting its past and future. This is what Heidegger considers to be the oblivion of being proper. Namely, the being itself is being concealed through its revealing of different epochal insights of traditional metaphysics. The being is congenial with time, because the time is the one phenomena that is a horizon in which man comprehends the world, but is never present, and it is in itself, as it is in itself. It is, by virtue of its very nature, always absent. Heidegger tries to express this by removing the temporal notion of presence inherent to copula is or ist in German and replacing it with very hard to translate German expression es gibt. Literal translation would be there is, but then you would not omit is. So he says es gibt sein, es gibt Zeit, which will translate with coming to pass. Hence, the being is coming to pass, the time is coming to pass. This coming to pass is radically different from that which is, i.e., that which is present. It is by its very essence always absent, yet necessary in order for individual beings to exist, and always simultaneously disclosed and veiled in and through them. And this absence is caused by what Heidegger considered to be his main insight, a radical finitude of Dasein. Endlichkeit. Namely, Dasein is in essence determined by its individuality and temporality. Individuality stems from the fact that Dasein is quote-unquote always mine, je mein in German, eigentlich. Eigentlich can be translated by authentic, but originally it means something possessed by me, something mine. I.e., its meaning cannot come outside of it, and it's always his individual relation to being. He is thrown in the world, geworfen, in the sense that he is a contingent, accidental fact. There is no way he can find any meaning in his whence, so he is originally pointed or projected towards wherefore, or the future. The essence of Dasein is to make itself a temporal, meaningful project. That project is, however, originally meaningless. Namely, while it has to project meaning, Dasein's origin is absolutely devoid of it, and the only authentically meaningful relation it can constitute is the one towards the end, that is, its death. While in everyday living Dasein indulges in various unoriginal, never really mine, or uneigentlich meaningful projects, if it reverts into itself in solitude, it comes to realize the original nothingness and meaninglessness of its everydayness. This disclosure comes to pass through the mood of Angst, which Heidegger points out as fundamental revelation of both Dasein's finitude and his relation to being. The Angst reveals that Dasein is finite, and that meaning stems from the defining moment of the finitude, i.e., it's always his own, eigentlich, je mein, death. The authentic Dasein, retired from the fuss of everyday, inauthentic existence, projects itself towards its death, constituting meaning in accordance with this absolute and unconditional possibility, which makes him an authentic individual, because one's own death can never be appropriated by or from someone else. Only from this tragic position can it go forward towards the meaningful relation to being in general. Few things are of note here. Namely, if you reflect on this, even and perhaps preferably without employing any notion from history or philosophy, you'll notice that something is fundamentally amiss. The very notion of finite Dasein implies infinite, eternal being. Heidegger always tried to obfuscate this both existential and essential fact by pointing out that its fairly natural occurrence is historical consequence of oblivion of being. But he fails to convince because the notion that being itself is finite in fact cannot be comprehended by human mind, and for a good reason. Namely, this is because the traditional terms of metaphysics are its naturally imprinted vocabulary, out of which it cannot comprehend anything higher or lower than everyday life. Heidegger attempted to circumvent this problem by decommissioning the traditional terminology with pedantic care from his writings and lectures, which turned him into one of the most obscure thinkers in the history of philosophy. Most of his later works, i.e. those that come after his crucial starting point from Sein und Zeit in 1927, are devised to develop a new quasi-poetical language that should prepare a small elite of thinkers to think being authentically as it discloses itself in a new epoch and new enthrallment. German word Ereignis, very hard to translate. You can also translate it as event of humans that will produce new meaning and transcend the modernity. The problem is, in order to make this happen, Heidegger abandoned not only terms and corresponding beings, such as substance, spirit, cause, origin, mind, but also the notions of man himself. Dasein is a man reduced to an individuum, that is, completely contingent and incomprehensible, isolated being whose essence is in fact, and in Heidegger's own words, nothingness. We are then supposed to expect that from out of this depersonalized, and as we shall see later, purely material nothingness, there will come to pass the new meaning. Croatian philosopher Marian Cipra depicts the situation in these terms. Quote, "This destruction only seemingly aims to loosen up petrified tradition," as Heidegger would put it, in order to clear up the obfuscations and getting us in a more authentic touch with the truth of being. For as we have seen above, being as relative to Dasein is for Heidegger originally von je, congenial with nothingness. No destruction of tradition can bring us to authentic meaning of being, because the a priori presupposition of fundamental ontology is radical metaphysical isolation of existence, individual and contingent, always mine, je mine, Dasein. As individual and contingent, always mine existence is in principle deprived of being and mind, as such indemonstrable and ontologically ineffable. Individuum est ineffabile, as scholastics very well knew. There is no thinking nor speaking about non-being, as Parmenides very well knew. Close quote. There is a good reason why Heidegger's philosophical project rings the bell with left-hand path luminaries. They also seek to affirm absolute, isolated individuality as a prime subject of their metaphysics and corresponding ideological practice. In the case of Dugin, even expanded to the notion of isolated ethnicity. The left-hand path practitioner is a quote-unquote sinister, satanic individual insofar as he shuns the everyday meaning imposed by quote-unquote mundanes and strives towards tapping into quote-unquote acausal energies. Those can be disclosed only to one who has achieved this quote-unquote always mine originality by complete rejection of all moral norms and practical subversion of them through the principle of adversary. And please relate this to the first part of this essay analysis on insight roles. The aim of magic is quote-unquote presencing of acausal energies, that is, laying oneself open to abyss through following the quote-unquote sevenfold way of order of the 9 angles initiation, which on closer scrutiny proves to be a radical and difficult method of depersonalization. Admittedly, Order of the Nine Angles teachings are heavily infused with Jungian and pop physics terminology, but are founded on the same hypermodern assumption of getting back to the roots and starting anew, both in individual and, as we shall see in the third part of this analysis, political sense. In contrast to Heidegger, the terms like consciousness, evolution, energies, and such are used. But the assumption of nothingness as an origin of both man and the world that has to be affirmed and appropriated in a creative way remains the same. This assumption is a telltale sign of modern mentality. Despite both Mayat's claims that Order of the Nine Angles is a continuation of ancient tradition, and Heidegger's declarative aim of reappropriating the philosophical tradition, because it is anthropocentrically founded, that is, it in fact tells us that anything that can be called transcendent must be comprehended solely in human terms, and, even more importantly, primarily on the grounds of comprehending what a human being is. The knowledge of a causal is possible, not through applying the mind, but through individual openness to it, that is always mine, and cannot be transmitted to others save by what is denoted as quote-unquote dark empathy, an ability to share the ontological mood that discloses the acausal. A left-hand path practitioner is to become a quote-unquote nexion, i.e. the gate between causal and acausal, through various ordeals of initiation, which include insight roles we described in previous episode of this analysis, but also through human sacrifice, so-called culling, various rituals, physical challenges, and finally a period of long isolation in nature that should finally quote-unquote destroy the ego and let the acausal energies flow through left-hand path Dasein to detach him from the world of the mundanes and reattach him to the acausal origin of all. Lovely, isn't it? Quite like in Heidegger, the knowledge comes as a destruction of natural human constitution, seemingly being only the peeling of the layers of quote-unquote false personality, created by everyday living of one being thrown in the world, geworfen in der Welt in Heideggerian terms, and the sinister mood which discloses, albeit never intellectually comprehends, the acausal. This is also the rejection of the natural position of human being towards the metaphysical principles, because it, on the one hand, completely rejects, in fact aims to destroy, the mind as a subject of knowledge, and, on the other hand, instead of uplifting towards that which is higher, turns towards the lower, subhuman, submundane, and subcausal, that has to overwhelm the Dasein or mage with its energies and channel them into the world at large through him. However, as left-hand path is in essence a practical affair, we are presented with various methods of achieving this, and for that purpose the whole conceptual framework has been built to aid the understanding. This is seemingly contradictory if we bear in mind that the ultimate aim is the utter irrationality, but only seemingly. Namely, Mayat is quite adamant about his elaborate system being only a means to an end, a map of consciousness to be used to approach its hidden, sinister root. The universe, as understood by Order of the Nine Angles, can best be described in a causal way by symbols, and all-encompassing symbol is what is dubbed Tree of Wird. Quote, "The Tree of Wird, as conventionally described, that is drawn, and with its correspondences and associations and symbols, represent certain acausal energies, and the individual who becomes familiar with such correspondences and associations and symbols can access, to a greater or lesser degree depending on their ability and skill, the energies associated with the Tree of Wird. The Tree of Wird itself is one symbol, one representation of that meaning, or, intersection of the causal and acausal, which is a human being, and can be used to represent the journey, the quest of the individual towards the acausal, that is, toward the goal of magic, which is the creation of a new, more evolved individual. End quote. Tree of Weird has been presented by Order of the Nine Angles as the true Aryan form of what quote-unquote Magian, and they mean Jewish by this, Kabbalah, distorted into Tree of Life. The word weird is an Old Norse term denoting fate, and the tree itself serves both metaphysical and practical function. It causally describes the acausal. To an extent it is possible, and provides the mental and ontological map which can be traversed in order to reach the in fact sub-mental infinity of acausal. Therefore, it is both a summation of metaphysical system and magical grimoire to be used for the practices ranging from hexing the mundanes. By the way, Mayat's favorite examples are, of course, some way of killing at a distance or screwing the reluctant romantic interest, and dissolving they are very mundane, interestingly enough, and dissolving the causal form, understood in Jungian terms of individuation as integration of psyche at the expense of ego consciousness, i.e., integration of unconscious or acausal archetypes, which, in contrast to Jung, are understood to unequivocally manifest evil. There is no black and white in them, as we have seen from one of the first quotes of Order of the Nine Angles on this matter. They are all dark. There is nothing to manifest but darkness, because it is non-being. The 7 stages of the tree represent primarily 7 planets, and taken together with the tree as a whole and its root dubbed the abyss, that is a causal infinity, they are eponymous 9 angles of Order of the Nine Angles. The aspiring initiate is to apply the active imagination, Jung again, to mentally traverse these quasi-Kabbalistic stations and gain insight into correspondences between them as well as their multiply meanings, because the presupposition is that planets also represent alchemical elements which are understood in Jungian sense of being the attributes of the psyche. In essence, the tree represents change, because in universe, according to Order of the Nine Angles, there is no stability, and one is obliged to realize this fact and manipulate it for his own ends, which is called external magic, and or to accomplish the individuation, which is called internal magic. The main method to traverse the tree is an elaborate board game, Mayat devised and dubbed the Star Game. Quote from Mayat, or our Anton Long, or Torguld West, if you prefer. Doesn't matter. The Star Game is a representation of the 9 aspects of the basic free, whose changing in causal time represent a particular presencing of an acausal energy. That is, the 9 represents not only the nexion, that is the presencing of the acausal evident in our psyche and consciousness, but also many other nexions as well. This particular representation is an abstract one, as distinct from the more causal symbology of the Tree of Weird and of the septernary system itself. End quote. The 3 aspects in question are ego, unconscious, and the self of Jungian psychiatry, depicted as alchemical substances of salt, mercury, and sulfur. The aim of the game is to experience the ways in which acausal invades the causal, both in metaphysical and everyday sense, so that initiate can internalize and use them for various purposes. Become, in fact, a nexion. The Star Game has three main functions. One is it develops certain levels of consciousness. The second is it is a new way of magical working appropriate to the 21st century and beyond, and see how modern it is, and postmodern even. And third, it is an aid to developing certain magical skills. The first of the aims detailed above involves in part a new way of thinking. This thinking, however, is not the rational, causal, logical type associated with science. End quote. This hermetical nature of Order of the Nine Angles system is best demonstrated through a star game because it is supposed to display the correspondences of universe with its own nexion called stargates, denoting concrete locations in the world where a causal invades the causal and the individual human being as a corresponding self-evolved gate which can serve the same purpose. So as above, so below. Hence hermetical. The game is played by elaborate set of rules on 7 boards built into spiral to represent the Tree of Wird. We won't delve into Mayat's explanation of the rules of the game, but only point out the essential thing about it. The star game is supposed to be a manifestation of new thinking, a contribution to completely new relationship between Dasein and being, supposedly based on the unwritten folk tradition of British Isles, to which one can reattach only with the ontological mood of dark empathy. It points out to what is considered in Order of the Nine Angles system as an advent of a new galactic aeon, the sinister dialectics ranging from harassing disabled women to terrorist attacks is intended to bring about. If allusions to Heidegger seem strenuous, let us hear what Mayat, West, Long, or whoever has to, but this is written under the pseudonym West, has to say about him. Quote, since being is an issue for man, this is a translation of Heidegger's notions of primordial disclosure of meaningful relation of man to being, from being and time. Man interprets causally because everyday Dasein, the Dasein which takes time, can be characterized as causal, or that interpretation of being as beings which is the there is. This is again translation of Dasein. It is better to say being here, being there. However, man interprets other than causally. This other interpretation, which is prior to the causal by reason of its existence, may be termed acausal. Acausal without the causal. And this acausal is what Homer in the Iliad speaks of when he says Kalchas is the most wise here because he understands all that is, was, and will be. Heidegger understands this as revealment and concealment, or elsewhere as unhiddenness, Unverborgenheit, aletheia in Greek, because Heidegger used etymologizing of Greek word aletheia, a Greek word for true, as being something rather different than our traditional conception of true as correspondence, but it's entirely another story. The primordial time of his Sein und Zeit, or being and time, is akin to this acausal or potentiality of man's being. End quote. Now, left-hand path interpreter applies his own terms to Heidegger's fundamental ontology, and quite rightly so. Namely, Dasein can indeed be seen as originally experiencing the meaning of being acausally, because Heidegger himself considers causality to be a notion of traditional metaphysics which veils the original potentiality disclosed through acceptance of absolutely certain potentiality of one's own death, an authentic being towards the end, Zuendesein. Namely, the original relation to being is not thinking, but mood, Befindlichkeit, which always lays out, Auslegen, some kind of openness, Erschlossenheit, of the meaning of being. The most authentic mood is the Angst, which is the fear without a cause, or the fear of nothingness. This mood lies out the question of the meaning of being, because it opens, erschließen, both its absence and Dasein's original nothingness. Causality is here observed as merely a presenting of mundane, inauthentic existence, which attempts to cover this fact by understanding the reality as actuality, while the authentic reality is precisely the potentiality of non-being, which, as it necessarily, causally of course, but why should Heidegger and Martin care about semantics, follows, is identical with being itself. This pure potentiality and identity is not to be understood in a dialectical sense, as is the case in Hegel's logic, where it necessarily unfolds its opposite and creates something, but phenomenologically, which means that it is in relation to Dasein's mood, always in relation to Dasein, cannot be thought without relation to Dasein. This means that moody blues of the acausal being is unconditionally related to man and his way of approaching it in utter irrationality, because the mind is supposedly a derived, inauthentic mode of understanding. If there were no man, there wouldn't be being. But since the man is finite, the being itself has to be finite too. Heidegger calls for the hermeneutics of facticity, that is, an authentic lying out of the facts of existence as they are prior to the emergence of logos, in the Platonic and or Christian sense of intelligible order underlying it. And as such, the Faktizität of the existence is completely and utterly meaningless and orderless, because it is conceived as Dasein's own projection, prompted by a bit of a nudge from the murky being itself. The only way open to understanding this is a new way of thinking that is utterly negative, in the sense that it seeks to go not beyond but below the level of actual beings, and into the pure potentiality out of which we should expect a kind of voice of being, the last God in, let's say, God in later Heidegger, enthronement event, Ereignis, or some such pseudo-intellectual, come quasi-religious crap, and finally appropriated in a new, non-metaphysical, meaning quasi-poetical language. Left-hand path luminary is, however, not satisfied with Heidegger's insistence on language as a quote-unquote house of being, i.e. his insistence that authentic revelation of being can come to pass primarily in the field of speech, Sage, the original essence of language in which the being is disclosed. The reason for this is the original purpose of appropriating Heidegger's analysis, namely to demonstrate the fundamentals of the theory of Wirth and the star game. Quote of Mayet, West. However, these correlations are at best hints concerning the nature of the causal and acausal, their true description, and thus that of being and being as beings can only be, as will be shown later, symbolic through mathematics. End quote. In left-hand path metaphysics, symbol is understood as the primordial causal form of being, which is later obfuscated by losing the primordial intuition of the acausal for the sake of living out the causal, mundane existence. Thus the true revelation of being is through symbols, and if the authentic system of those symbols could be constructed, it can lead towards the solving of Dasein in primordial change, which is the original meaning of being. Quote, "The fundamental characterization of the causal is consciousness, that of the causal, acausal, the unconscious. This conscious horizon may be expressed in terms of the history of being, by thought and feeling, the unconscious by sensation and intuition. This experiencing is the symbol from which word derives. For man, thought is part of this unconcealment, intuition the other, since being possesses as potentiality in the change that is man, not only thought but also symbol. And this symbolic perception of being, this experiencing of being as the one, as that which presents or transforms, is explicit for Western philosophy in pre-Socratics. As Tao, this perception is today becoming understood again, and with Heidegger the task of its understanding is begun." End quote. Of course, quote-unquote Nazarene patristics, Platonism, and such trivialities which quite consequently are less causally unfolded and developed pre-Socratic insights and what was contained in them couple of millennia ago are nothing but inauthentic rationalism that gave birth to modernity. So we'll just start all over again, authentically, and stand, quote-unquote, against the modern world. Give me a break. This pompous, pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-human even, crap is only good to show how depraved the real essence of modernity is, because Heidegger's attempts are consequently modern. No medieval or ancient thinker would dream to start anew from nothingness, because he knew that the only nothingness, the other of every being, as he said in Greek, heteron panton, is a pure being, pure eternity, pure light, and the most of all, pure causality. In any case, this violent, as Heidegger would put it, gewaltbrachende interpretation of pre-Socratic philosophers, Heidegger probably misappropriated from German mystics as Meister Eckhart and their metaphorical interpretation of scriptures, is as pervasive as bulldozer mechanic teaching gynecology class. Moreover, it is by its very nature confined to its practitioner, Heidegger himself, because it can only stem from isolated individuality, laying out the ontological mood disclosing the being. There is absolutely no way this lying out can really be communicated to others except by deliberately, and consequently, alas, causality again, weaving the pure illusion as the essence of truth and knowingly accepting it as such. The same applies to wannabe left-hand path Heideggerian we just quoted above. It is my contention that precisely this standpoint demonstrates the most extreme pitfall of modernity, an attitude which hates it so much because it is unable to see any good, beauty and truth of being in it, that it affirms its worst excesses. It is in this sense consequently hypermodern, affirming that only human being exists and then trying to transcend this by digging below its foundation, dissolving it into nothingness, which it, when observed in isolation, really is. I beg the reader to excuse my Nazarene prejudice, but there is no escape from the conclusion that the only way to eradicate the order of cosmos and its author, because this is what it boils down to in the end, is to dig your own grave in the metaphysical mud called primal matter or materia prima. Left-hand path Stargamer again to our aid. Quote, "The most fundamental symbol is being. From being there is a change. The abstraction of change is the idea of extension, which leads to the concept of transformation or potentiality. Potentiality itself is implicit within being, and through man's existence this potentiality becomes the striving toward authenticity. The idea of the essence, that is the symbol, change, is extension. The idea of the essence, that is being, is unity, and the idea of change leads through abstraction to the concept of transformation or duration. This duration, by identification with man's terminality or finitude, embodies time, and accordingly time is understood as implicit in man's being, projected onto the world. Abstractly, this duration is the continuum and the concept of number, thought's perception of change as it issues in man through apprehension of individuality. Only change exists for being, not time or number. Further, the concept of set derives from that of continuum and number, since intuitively a set is a totality or aggregate. Now this is very convoluted, not only because a difficult idea, but because it is very badly written. But now I'll explain what it means. Namely, here, dear reader, we have a pure, unadulterated example of what René Guénon called the reign of quantity. Namely, the pure potentiality of a causal can be intuited through its projections of extension and aggregate of individuums, from Aristotle onwards depicted as categories of quantity which cannot exist in themselves, let alone be primordial expressions of being. What Maat does here, quite consequently, alas, causality again, following Heidegger, is nosediving into very midst of matter, and attempting to go not beyond, but below materialism, and dissolve symbols in their origin, a pure, non-existent potentiality of matter. Hence the abyss, chaos, a causal. Hence adversary principle, terrorism, and sinister dialectics. Hence, to repeat a quote, an insight that, quote, no dark side exists because what actually exists is dark of itself, because its presence is non-being, end quote. Indeed it does, if you are a psychopath, or, to put it more consequently, mentalopath, because this is far worse than simple degenerative psychology. It is a mental adjustment to the essence of what is the worst in modernity, an attempt to understand the world on the basis of pathological or otherwise depraved human individual, something shared by founding fathers of modern intellectual culture like Marx, Freud, Heidegger, Rosenberg, and their followers, academic or otherwise. In respect to Martin Heidegger, Marian Tsipra again deserves to be quoted at length here. Quote, obviously, after Hegel, there came to pass, both in thinking and in actual reality, a certain abandon of mind, which perhaps began long before in the ancient world, but became manifest only then. The rule of blind affects and the will deprived of ideas is fundamental characteristic of post-Hegelian modernity. This was clearly felt and expressed by premier thinkers of the age, by Marx in his formulation of radical humanism, that is, quote of Marx, the man is the root of the man, and world revolution born in the class hatred, by Nietzsche in his experience of nihilism and effect of loathing towards everything that is, that's the great loathing, quoting Nietzsche, to understand everything means to loathe everything, end quote, and finally by Heidegger himself, from affects of fear and angst, disclosing the congeniality of being and nothingness. There we have three fundamental modern affects: hate, loathing, and angst. Wherefore it follows, a revolutionary change or destruction of the world, Veränderung or Vernichtung, will unto Overman or Übermensch, stemming from loathing towards man, and finally the angst of care, stemming from fundamental nothingness of existence. To be modern in any of these senses, or indeed in all of them at once, consequently means to be alone in the world where everyone hates everyone, everyone loathes everyone, and everyone fears everyone. In the midst of such modernity, which represents a perfect deprivation of mind, its ultimate descent, Heidegger descends the deepest. That being, in my opinion, his major philosophical accomplishment. He grasps and lies out the eminent, in fact the only possibility of such modernity, and this possibility is death. End quote. So in conclusion, let us repeat why is this descent into fringe of the fringe relevant and what does it teach us. Order of the Nine Angles is the most radical formulation of the left-hand path metaphysics, and it is being astonishingly congruent with some of the most prominent and influential ideas of modernity. Ideas, one might add, quite prominent on the Western right and further radicalized by luminaries of alt-right, above all those influenced by Alexander Dugin, who is, as I have demonstrated elsewhere, quite on board with this kind of unthinking. When we put this in the context of fringe ideas creeping into center, this kind of thinking ceases to be the darkness at the edge of the global city, but could very well start to emanate from its center. Let us not forget Heidegger's supposed lapse into Nazism, in which he was, of course, looking for authentic, could it be eigentlich, form of truly national and truly socialist German Europe. The most of the left-hand path prone thinkers, both on the fringe and around the center, seek to politically affirm, quote-unquote, a true right, true nationalism, true white identity, and so on. So in itself, this kind of thinking is not at all removed from the academic and political circles. For example, one American professor of philosophy, in answer to a comment to his rather good lecture on Heidegger, has this to say. I omit the whole quote, I'll just quote the last sentence. In transcript you'll find the whole quotation. This professor is probably what Americans call liberal. Now listen what he said. Lastly, I'd always remember that the original question of being quite naturally, clandestinely, but necessarily slips back into metaphysics. At least for the moment, for, quote of Heidegger, being is always the being of a being. And now listen to this. And this metaphysical thinking will continue to prevail until the spirit of humanity can again find the courage to surrender ego and become the nothingness through which a new beginning can arise. End quote. This conclusion could very well be put in some of Order of the Nine Angle manuscripts. And the person is a regular, mainstream, and probably quite socially acceptable man. Not probably, he's a university professor and he doesn't seem to be right-wing at all. But there you have it. But truly sinister, in quite Order of the Nine English sense, is the worldview emerging from the bowels of internet, carried by young people lurking the chants and forums, of which he already wrote at length. Namely, the invocation of dark God by technological meme magic seems quite congruent with Order of the Nine Angle principles laid out in the previous passages. The invocation of Keck, Pepe the Frog, who supposedly helped imagine Trump into existence, together with the belief in synchronicities, which are acausal links that nevertheless display meaningful connections, seem to be precisely the kind of delusional sinister magic left-hand practitioner would prefer. The image was invoked from below, i.e. from the utterly chaotic bowels of internet, and then got enmeshed in infinite web of meaningful connections which are completely horizontal, hence unrelated to anything above, but only to interaction of irrational mass intuition and unknown something that supposedly answered its call. Did Keck really put Donald Trump on the throne? Yes and no. In the chaos, yes and no are the same in quite positive way, namely the acausal is based on ontological and not merely psychological delusion. This is the way the abyss of matter behaves when it starts to dissolve under the feet of gullible humans trying to reflect their desires upon it. The matter in primordial sense of infinite possibility without intrinsic principle of reality can best be described as a fluid mirror, which reflects images projected upon it. The thinking of matter in the metaphysical sense is impossible. It can only be imagined and serve as an infinite possibility to reflect imagination. I consider the supposedly marginal political fringe of alt-right, order of the nine angles, chance, etc., as a prime example of modernity, pushing its worst extremity to its consequent conclusion. The metaphysical illusion starts to really act upon the world in quite autonomous way. The fact that it is an illusion does not diminish its influence, because it is capable to act upon the humans and deepen their own delusion that they can absolutely reform the world in their own image. This is submaterialism, subhumanism, based not on metaphysics but subphysics, a counter-image of truth. Order of the Nine Angles system worked upon this possibility long ago on the fringe of the fringe, and devised a philosophy of history and political ideal that now, as crazy as it may sound, can slowly move into the center. The idea of quote-unquote galactic imperium and development of quote-unquote new man now doesn't seem far-fetched, not on the grounds of some inexistent technological achievement that could make it possible, but precisely because people are growing accustomed to accept something like that as a relevant political goal. After all, some of its equivalents can be seen in white ethnostate, sought after by alt-right leadership, as well as in neo-Eurasianist existential empire of Dasein, promoted by Alexander Dugin. And a lot of people now do not see this as anything far-fetched, although 20 years ago it would have been considered pure insanity, like gay marriages, as Richard Spencer aptly puts it in one of his Al Jazeera interviews, namely comparing the methods of alt-right with the methods of gay movement to bring about something which is patently absurd and make it natural, using the same methods. That is, I think, to accomplish more the less in essential way, in essential sense, the same nihilistic goal. To demonstrate the depravity of politics built upon this counter-metaphysics, which I define as left-hand path across the board, from alt-right to Dugin, because Maat is definitely the most consequent, alas, causality again, unthinker who developed it, will proceed to expound the order of the nine angles political ideology and the idea of dark gods in the third and final part of this analysis. Thank you for your attention.